And you're absolutely right. It's what the people want to pay for. If they want 7.5 or 9 or 10 or 2, that should be up to the local community. The local community has to understand what they're getting today, though. And I must admit, in all my travels, albeit mostly in North County, when you're the one laying on the floor, you wish it was 2.5 minutes. It's easy to sit in the room when you're all healthy and say, 7 minutes. Well, just sit there and look at your watch and just see how long 7 minutes is, and imagine yourself with a loved one laying on the floor in front of you, whether it be simply with pain from a hip fracture. It's a long time compared to what you're used to. I used to have residents tell me what they want is, they want to hang up the phone from 911 and hear a siren. That's what they want. So, that's just where you are. But you're right, it's the community's desires and needs as to what level of service they want. The last thing I'll say about the 4.5 minutes is remember that in most cases, your fire service is coming from that same fire station that you're getting your 4.5-minute EMS response from. Fire department deployment by national standards and best practices is to arrive before something occurs called flashover. The idea is to have a fully complement first arriving unit there within 5 minutes. So it's highly unlikely that even if EMS changed their goal of 4.5 or their current practice of 4.5, that anything will change at your local fire station.
Well, I just want to say, I think Barbara, your issue is really good because on one hand, we don't want to give up anything on those most critical of incidents, but we have a lot of non-urgent incidents. And so, again, it goes back to common sense. And that, again, is where medical priority dispatch really comes in. Getting that right resource, make sure that resource is there for the most critical need and not tied up with something that's not critical and not over-responding to the point then a mile away you have another something that's critical and everybody's already at this other non-critical thing. And I think I don't disagree with Chief Engel in one regard that, you know, we have to kind of citizens have to try to understand what medical priority dispatch is. The hospitals certainly do. I mean, it's basic triage. Again, making sure the most important incident, the most critical incident gets the right response. I have, in 2009, these guys have heard it a million times, I do have a sense of what we're talking about because in 2009, my 70-year-old mother did fall. Actually, a car started driving away. She was half in and half out of a car. She had a broken kneecap. She was lying on the pavement just off the curb, so it was in kind of the parking lot drive area. She was not in distress, but she was 78 years old. I was over her. I was on with 911. Palm Harbor, the chief's group did come. I think in 4 minutes, she is an alpha. She is an alpha. We checked it. She would be an alpha call, which would be just where we're going to be doing medical priority dispatch. So it might be several minutes later that I'd be standing, being over her, as long as she wasn't in distress. Now, if I called and I said, my mom can't breathe, she's in a lot of pain, you know, that potentially would elevate her call status. So basically, it might mean a few more minutes. We got to Countryside emergency room. She got taken in. She was in a room. We sat in a room with her for about an hour before we got to X-ray. It didn't change the outcome. And I think that's really why it's kind of medical priority dispatch is really trying to take that common sense perspective. When do you have to rush and take that risk of rushing when maybe somebody else is going to need that because it really is going to change their outcome? But I think you go to the heart of it. We do not want to make our response times long for critical issues. But we've got to be realistic. Do we want all this rush to things that aren't as critical? And that may take some culture change for our citizens. And I don't disagree. People need to kind of get their head around that unless they really want to keep sending everything to everyone for everything, and we're going to pay a fortune for it.
Yes.
I want to make
I'm going to take that. I talk loud enough. You don't have to worry about giving me a mic.
We have people in the back that can't hear you. As a citizen, I feel very concerned in the fact that firefighters are there in a state of readiness to put out my house fire, to respond to my emergency. If we start having them respond and taking patients to the hospital, who is going to be there in a state of readiness to put out my house fire when they're sitting in the back of an ambulance in an ER waiting to be put into bed? That's the first thing that I want to say. And the second thing is that, you know, you say you're grassroots. I understand that. You know, we put 550 people to work here in Pinellas County. If the fire department takes over transport, they say they're going to take approximately 200 of those people. Well, what's going to happen to the other 350? If we want to bring people to work in Pinellas County, we have to bring privatization in Pinellas County. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a real, it's not really a question, I'm just curious, you know, between where Tri-City Plaza is and Gulf to Bay, it's miserable. How do you respond quickly to an emergency? Do you find alternate routes? I know you have ambulances placed around Almerton Road and all those areas. You want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's, by the way, John Peterson, Director of Operations at Sunstar. There's no doubt that driving emergency in Pinellas County is a challenge. There are certain areas where you just can't get around traffic. We train our employees with some specific techniques of how to respond in those situations. And if they deem that it's just too dangerous or that putting the public at risk, they will shut their lights and sirens off if they have to and notify dispatch. That's very rare, but some of those situations do occur. The other thing is specific posting. Debbie talked a little bit earlier about our strategic planning as far as where we post the ambulances. Part of that strategic planning is posting them in areas where they will have easy access to be able to get to roads where they're not going to be locked up in gridlock traffic, so they can respond quicker than certain areas like we're speaking of. That makes sense.
Thank you. I'll take Phil and then John.
You know, I've had the experience of the response, the dual response. The dual response is a delayed response. And to me, it's unconscionable that we're talking about price, cost. What is the cost of someone's life? And as Engel had said, if you're on the floor with a heart attack or pains in the chest, you don't know if you're getting an embolism, you don't know if you're getting a stroke, you don't know if you're getting a heart attack, you don't know if you're losing any oxygen to the brain. Delay is wrong. It is malpractice, plain and simple. And that is what is done. It's unconscionable that you talk about a dual response. All I have heard today is cost, cost, cost. We are the stakeholders, not even the fire engine people or you. You're not the stakeholders. We are. The people who pay this $35 million a year. Plus you do charge $600 every time you come, which you split with the county. Plus on the side you make $45, which you have another business going, which you charge $45 a year for someone for an annual contract, whether or not they have insurance. That's a great business. I wish I was in it. The most important thing is take the patient to the ER as soon as possible. That's the most important thing. And you're not doing it. I'm sick and tired. When I had to call my wife, she had a stent 3 years ago, and I called 911. The firemen came in about 3 minutes. They take the EKG test, which even if it's normal, doesn't mean you delay, or you think that your mother wasn't in trouble, or we shouldn't think that my wife is in trouble. Because you can die right after an EKG normal test. They took all the tests, blood pressure, oxygen, and so on. Then we sit and wait. And then when Sunstar came, the firemen told everybody, told Sunstar, everything they took, all the problems, the preconditions, the medicine that she was taking, and so on. And they put her in the ambulance, and I'm waiting there for another 15 minutes while you took some more tests, instead of taking my wife to the hospital. When we see Sunstar running through the traffic with the lights on, the sirens on, that's to try and beat the firemen, and you never do it. And what did you do? 25 miles an hour you drove to take my wife to the hospital, and she did have a stent put in. Now, how do we know? You can't tell. An ambulance is not a substitute for the ER. You don't know. You don't know what was happening to your mother. We are the stakeholders. We are the ones that you have to take care of. We pay your salary. We pay all this money. And we want to be taken to the ER as soon as possible. And all I hear is cost, cost, cost. And I'm actually sick and tired. First rule is take the patient to the ER as fast as possible. And that's what the firemen do. It is your statistics and everyone who calls 911. Rule number 2 is see rule number 1.
John.
I believe it's working. Question, from where I used to live in New Jersey, there I was in very large township. We had basically all of it was voluntary, the way they ran it. But how they did it, fire was essentially fire, first aid was first aid. And I went from real small town, rural, to almost city-like conditions. And one of the changes they made in their first response, they had roving SUVs, like the Ford Broncos, with all the emergency equipment in it, with trained people, just like the Sunstars do, where you stage people in different areas to try and anticipate where you're going to be needed. So you've got that emergency person on scene right away. If it's an auto accident, generally they get there right away. And unless it was a police officer or that EMT that showed up, they would be the one that called the ambulance to say, yes, we need an ambulance. It could be a police officer called for an ambulance even before an EMS person got there to say, yes, this is real critical. That's something I wonder about, why we have full-size fire engines, which are not cheap to run.
That's your question.
Running around. The other thing is, do we have here that we did have up there the emergency, whether it was the police or the ambulance or the fire, they had controls for the traffic lights. So if you're running down the main road, you're running up 19 where there are lights, and you're anticipating how far, a half a mile down the road, you've got a system that's going to be turning red. They could override it, and it would just stay green. So they would help themselves to clear the traffic by having this override system to make sure that when they got to that intersection, they weren't fighting with, oh, it just turned red, and now you got cars coming the other way. It eliminated it. And it worked like remote control for a garage.
Okay, so I guess the question is, why do we take fire trucks to houses?
Yeah.
And do you use the override system?
Just to answer the second question, and then I'll pass the mic. I had a group of students who are working with the County's Youth Advisory Committee, and we had our first little field trip out to Public Works just last week. And some of the county employees out there were able to show the students the actual devices, the cameras, the beams, the sensors that do exactly that. I'm not sure how widespread it is in the county. I'll let someone else answer that. But the students really enjoyed getting to see the actual mechanism and how it all works. So we do have that technology.
Yeah, on number two, most of the fire departments do use the traffic preemption system. It's called Opticom, particularly in the main corridors like 19 Gulf to Bay, et cetera, et cetera. Your first question asked about a fire truck, and I didn't know if Craig or somebody wanted to take it. Just remember one thing, as a fire chief, here's how I look at it. You have to have that fire truck. 80% of the cost of running the fire truck's personnel. If we quit going to all medical calls, we'd save several $1,000s a year out of the $70 million program in fuel.
Another vehicle?
Well, see, here's the problem, and I'll use one of my fire stations because we're right across the street there from Phil. If we had a smaller vehicle there, we would have to staff it. So I'd have 3 guys on the fire truck and 2 guys on the smaller vehicle to go to EMS calls. We are not like St. Pete or Lellman in some of the areas that are a little bit bigger. It wouldn't be effective for us to hire 2 or really 6 additional people to staff that smaller vehicle, because we have to have the fire truck staffed anyway. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and that's one of our concerns in the busier areas, is the IPS study that the county's looking at is all ALS engines or ladders, which are the larger trucks. In the areas that it's really busy, it does make more sense if they can hire that additional staff. But you're going to have the fire trucks anyway.
Yeah, I think that pretty well says. I agree with the chief's perspective there. I'll address from the volunteer standpoint that just the demographics of the community, the population density, the amount of service calls that we run about 180,000 calls a year. That really metropolitan Florida is a lot different than I grew up in upstate New York, and the call density there is so much less that really here You have an aging population, that they have a high utilization of the services, a high expectation of the